The first time I realized my life no longer belonged to me was not during a fight. It was during a phone call that ended too politely. "Don't worry," my mother said, her voice calm in the way it always was when a decision had already been made. "We've talked it through as a family. This is what's best." She hung up before I could ask what this actually meant. I stood in the narrow hallway of my apartment in Madison, Wisconsin, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the deadline hum. The heater rattled. Somewhere downstairs, a neighbor slammed a door. Life continued, as if nothing had shifted, but something had. My name is Claire Morgan. I was 31 years old at the time, and until that moment, I believed I was an adult with choices. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday in early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I remember because I'd just come back from work, coat still on, laptop bag sliding off my shoulder. I worked as a senior compliance analyst for a regional healthcare network. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, well-paid, and required a level of precision most people underestimated. I liked that part. The quiet authority of knowing the rules better than the people who thought they could bend them. My family never really understood my job. They only understood outcomes, salaries, titles, appearances, and control. My parents, Harold and Linda Morgan, lived in a large house outside Milwaukee, the kind of house that looked impressive from the street, but felt cold inside. Everything polished, everything curated. My younger brother Daniel still lived nearby, worked in real estate, and was widely regarded as the successful one, despite the fact that my income had surpassed his years earlier. That had always been the pattern. Daniel was celebrated. I was relied on. The reason for my mother's call became clear an hour later when an email arrived. It was from a law firm I'd never contacted, but recognized immediately. Patterson & Cole, Estate and Trust Attorneys. Subject: Family Trust Restructuring. Notice. I opened it standing up, my coat still half on. The email was formal, polite, efficient. It informed me that the Morgan Family Living Trust was being amended, that certain assets would be reallocated, that I was no longer listed as a future beneficiary of the primary property holding. In plain language, I was being removed. No explanation, no meeting request, just a notification. My first instinct was confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, creeping clarity that made my stomach tighten. I called Daniel. "Did you know about this?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Too long. "Mom said you'd probably take it personally," he replied. "Take what personally?" I said. "Losing my inheritance without a conversation?" He sighed. "It's not like that. They're just simplifying things." "For whom?" "For the family," he said. I laughed once. Short, sharp, not amused. "And I'm not family anymore?" "That's not what anyone said," he replied quickly. "You're just more independent. You don't need it like I do." There it was, the compliment that doubles as a sentence. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said goodbye and ended the call. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry either. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I'd ignored for years. Holidays where my schedule was adjusted without asking. Decisions framed as care. Help that came with expectations, but no acknowledgement. Love, I realized, had always come with terms. The next morning, I called the law firm. "I'd like a copy of the amended trust documents," I said calmly. The assistant hesitated. "I'm not sure you're authorized." "I was a listed beneficiary for over a decade," I replied. "I'm requesting documentation related to my removal." There was a pause. Keyboard clicks. "I'll see what I can do," she said. That was the moment the imbalance became real. Not emotional. Structural. I went to work as usual, reviewed policy updates, flagged a potential compliance violation that saved my department a future audit headache. My boss thanked me in passing. Life continued to reward competence. Family, apparently, did not. By Friday, the documents arrived. 47 pages. Dense, legal, cold. The amendment had been signed 6 weeks earlier. My parents, Daniel as successor trustee. My removal was described as voluntary. That word sat heavy on the page. Voluntary implies consent. I had given none. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Susan Adler, mid-50s, sharp eyes, no patience for emotional fog. She read the documents in silence. They didn't need your consent, she said finally, but they did need to notify you, which they did. Barely. Is it legal? I asked. Yes, she replied. Is it ethical? That's a different conversation. I nodded. What are my options? She looked at me carefully. That depends on what you want. I didn't answer right away because until that moment, I'd never been asked that question without an agenda attached. What did I want? Not revenge, not drama. I wanted my autonomy back. Susan closed the file. There's something else, she said. The trust references a separate property transfer from your grandmother's estate. There's a note here. Incomplete. Incomplete how? Undocumented execution, she said, meaning something was planned but not finalized. My pulse quickened. Just slightly. What does that mean? I asked. She met my eyes. It means there may be more to this than they've told you. I walked out of her office an hour later, with copies, notes, and a quiet certainty. This hadn't started as an act of cruelty. It had started as convenience. They'd assumed I would accept it. They'd assumed I would stay quiet. They were wrong. And as I drove home through streets already decorated for Christmas, lights blinking cheerfully in windows, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about money. It was about control. And I was done letting other people decide what my place in their story was. Because if I had learned anything from my work, it was this. Systems don't change unless someone forces them to. And I was about to become that someone. The first thing I did was nothing. That wasn't indecision. It was calculation. I went to work. I answered emails. I showed up to meetings and nodded at the right moments. If anyone noticed that I'd gone quiet, they didn't say so. Silence had always been my default currency in the family. I'd learned early that reacting only made decisions feel negotiable to the people making them. I wasn't interested in negotiation. Thanksgiving arrived with its usual choreography. My parents' house smelled like roasted turkey and furniture polish. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. The same framed photos of Daniel in suits, Daniel with clients, Daniel at closings. I appeared once in a group shot, half-cropped. No one mentioned the trust. Not at dinner, not over dessert, not while we watched football in the living room. My mother refilled glasses and asked about my job with exaggerated cheer. My father talked about interest rates and property values. Daniel avoided my eyes. I watched them all carefully, the way I did at work when I suspected someone was omitting something important. People give themselves away when they think you're not looking. At one point, my mother leaned over and said softly, "I hope you're not upset." I smiled. Why would I be? She hesitated, then nodded, satisfied. She believed the smile. After dinner, while my parents cleaned up, Daniel followed me into the hallway. "They didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "They didn't ask if they would," I replied. He frowned. "You always make things bigger than they need to be." That had been said to me my entire life. I looked at him. "And you always assume they're small because you're not the one losing anything." His jaw tightened. "You're still doing fine. You have your job, your apartment. You don't need the house." Need. Another word used as a weapon, disguised as concern. "I didn't say I needed it," I replied. "I said I was removed." He shrugged. "Mom says you'll understand eventually." Eventually. The timeline of people who don't expect consequences. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the trust documents again. Not with anger, with focus. The amendment referenced my grandmother, Eleanor Morgan, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She'd been the only one in the family who treated me like a person instead of a role. She used to tell me I asked the right questions, that I saw things others missed. I noticed now that a specific property Eleanor had intended to place in a separate trust was mentioned but never attached. I pulled out her old letters, scanned copies I'd kept because no one else wanted them. One line stood out, written in careful cursive. "Make sure the lake place is handled properly. I don't trust Harold with details." The lake place. I hadn't thought about it in years. I searched county records the next morning. The property was still listed under Eleanor's name. Not transferred, not sold. In legal terms, unresolved. I called Susan. "She knew," Susan said after reviewing the information. "Your grandmother knew this would happen." Why didn't she fix it? I asked. Maybe she thought she had more time, Susan replied. Or maybe she thought someone else would catch it. I sat quietly. So what does this mean? I asked. It means the trust amendment may not be as clean as your parents think, she said. And it means you have standing. They didn't anticipate. Standing. Another word I liked. The following week, my mother called. We're thinking of selling the lake property, she said casually. Daniel thinks it's a good time. My heart slowed. What lake property? She paused. Just a fraction. You know, she said. Your grandmother's place. I didn't know it was in the trust, I said. It's complicated, she replied quickly. Your father's handling it. I'd like to see the paperwork, I said. Silence. That's not necessary, she said. It is if my name was removed based on it, I replied. She sighed. You're being difficult. There it was. When logic fails, label the person. I didn't push. I didn't argue. I hung up and called Susan. They're moving, I said. Yes, Susan replied. And they don't know you're watching. That weekend, I drove out to the lake. The house was empty, windows dark, leaves piled against the porch. I stood on the dock and looked out at the water Eleanor had loved. The place felt paused, like it was waiting. I took photos, documented conditions, pulled records. I wasn't emotional. I was methodical. Because this wasn't about confronting them. It was about understanding the full scope of what had been taken and what, quietly, had never been theirs to take in the first place. When I got back to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Mom says we need to talk. You're making things uncomfortable. I typed back. You made them official. I'm just reading the paperwork. I put the phone away. The truth was emerging in pieces. Small, overlooked, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. They thought I would ignore it. They thought I would move on. They had mistaken my patience for acceptance. And they were about to learn the difference. Because once you see the system clearly, you don't argue with it. You use it. And I was just getting started. The lake house stayed quiet after Thanksgiving. No for sale sign. No contractor trucks. No sudden activity that would have drawn attention. That alone told me something had changed. My parents were cautious now. Not because they'd done something wrong, but because they sensed resistance where they'd expected compliance. That was new. At work, I finished a compliance review that had been sitting in another department's queue for months. I flagged 3 discrepancies, all minor, all fixable. My director thanked me and asked, half joking, if I ever slept. I smiled and said yes. I didn't say that I'd been up late most nights reading probate statutes and trust law instead. I met Susan Adler again the following Monday. Her office was quiet, lined with framed degrees and shelves of binders labeled with years and initials. She liked preparation. I liked that about her. You were right, she said, sliding a folder across the desk. The lake property was never retitled. Legally, it never entered the trust. So it shouldn't have been referenced in the amendment, I said. Correct, she replied. Which raises a problem. They used an asset they didn't control to justify reallocation. I absorbed that slowly. Is that illegal? I asked. Potentially, she said. But more importantly, it's sloppy. And sloppy is where leverage lives. I nodded. Susan continued. Your grandmother's will directed that property to be placed into a separate holding, with beneficiaries listed. You and Daniel equally. My chest tightened, just slightly. They bypassed that? I asked. They never completed it, she said, which means the court can still enforce the original intent. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I felt something colder and steadier settle in my chest. They didn't just remove me, I said. They rewrote her wishes. Yes, Susan replied. And they assumed no one would notice. I thought of Eleanor's handwriting, her insistence on details, her distrust of shortcuts. She'd known. What's the next step? I asked. Susan leaned back. We don't confront. Not yet. First, we document. Then, we file a notice of interest. That sounds public, I said. It's quiet, she replied. But it freezes movement. They won't be able to sell or transfer the property without addressing you. I considered it. Do it, I said. The notice was filed on a Thursday afternoon. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a recorded document that changed the ground beneath their feet. My mother called that evening. "Did you put something on the lake house?" she asked, voice tight. "I protected my interest," I replied. "There was no need for that," she said. "We were handling it." "You didn't tell me how," I said. "You don't trust us," she accused. "I read the paperwork," I said. "That's not distrust. That's verification." She went quiet. "This is tearing the family apart," she said finally. "No," I replied. "This is revealing where it was already cracked." She hung up. Daniel texted me an hour later. "Why are you doing this?" I typed back slowly. "Because I was excluded without consent, and I'm correcting the record." He didn't respond. Over the next 2 weeks, things shifted subtly. The lake house listing never appeared. My parents stopped mentioning it altogether. At Christmas, there were fewer calls, shorter conversations. Distance masquerading as peace. I let it. Because behind the scenes, more threads were coming loose. Susan uncovered correspondence between my father and the trust attorney that referenced Eleanor's informal intentions instead of the written will. Language designed to soften deviation, to create plausible deniability. It wouldn't hold. "Do you want to pursue this fully?" Susan asked me during our next meeting. "What does fully mean?" I asked. "It means petitioning the probate court to enforce the original directive," she said. "It means your parents will have to explain why they didn't." "And Daniel?" I asked. "He'll be pulled in," she said. "As successor trustee." I closed my eyes briefly. This was the moment I'd been avoiding. Not because I was afraid, but because once I crossed this line, there would be no returning to polite distance. No pretending this was just a misunderstanding. This would be action. "I'm not doing this to punish them," I said. "I know," Susan replied. "You're doing it to restore agency." "Yes," I said. "Exactly." She nodded. Then we proceed. The petition was drafted over the next week. Precise, unemotional, built entirely on documentation. When it was filed, I received a confirmation number and nothing else. No call. No reaction. 3 days later, Daniel showed up at my apartment. He looked tired, not angry, confused. "They're freaking out," he said. "I didn't ambush them," I replied. "I followed the law." "You didn't have to make it public," he said. "I didn't," I replied. "The court did." He sat on the edge of my couch, rubbing his hands together. "They think you're trying to take everything," he said. I looked at him. "I'm trying to take what was never theirs to redirect," I said. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked quietly, "What happens now?" I met his eyes. "Now," I said, "a judge reads the truth without family context attached." That was the part they'd never planned for. They'd relied on history, on emotion, on my tendency to stay quiet to keep things smooth. They hadn't accounted for process. And process, unlike people, doesn't get tired of being fair. The hearing date arrived in my inbox that night. Early January, right after the holidays. Perfect timing, I thought, because once the decorations came down and the pretending ended, there would be nothing left to hide behind. And the system they'd trusted to protect their version of events was about to do something very different. It was about to listen. The hearing date sat on my calendar like a quiet threat. January 12th, Probate Court, Department C. No exclamation points, no emotional weight in the font, just a line of text that shifted how everyone in my family slept at night. I didn't tell anyone at work. There was no reason to. This wasn't a crisis. It was a process unfolding exactly as designed. I kept my routine steady. Morning coffee, commute, meetings, lunch at my desk. The steadiness was deliberate. I'd learned that people grew reckless when they believed you were calm because you didn't care, not because you were prepared. My parents, on the other hand, grew frantic. My mother called twice a day for a week. I didn't answer. When I finally did, it was on a Sunday afternoon, after I'd reviewed the latest filings with Susan. "This is humiliating," she said immediately. "Do you know how this looks?" "I know how it reads," I replied. "We raised you," she said. "We didn't deserve this." I waited. Silence has weight when you let it sit. "Did you read Eleanor's will?" I asked, finally. "That's not the point," she snapped. "It's the only point," I said. "The rest is narrative." She sighed sharply. "You always reduce things to documents." "Because documents don't rewrite themselves," I replied. She hung up. Daniel didn't call. Instead, he sent an email. Formal, careful, copied to my father. We believe this dispute can be resolved privately. Litigation benefits no one. I forwarded it to Susan with a single line. Your thoughts? She called me within 10 minutes. They want you to withdraw the petition, she said. Yes, I replied. They'll likely offer a settlement, she continued. Something to make this go away. What kind? I asked. Partial interest. Or cash equivalent, she said. Enough to seem reasonable. Not enough to admit fault. I considered that. And if I refuse? I asked. Then we proceed, she said. And the judge will ask questions they don't want to answer. That night, I dreamed of Eleanor's house the way it used to be. Windows open, light on the water. Her voice calling me in for dinner. The dream wasn't sad. It was clarifying. I woke up knowing exactly what I would do. The settlement offer arrived 3 days later. A courier envelope. Thick paper. Legal language designed to sound generous. They offered me a cash payout equal to 1/3 of the lake property's estimated value, contingent on my withdrawing all claims and waiving future challenges to the trust. Daniel had signed it. My father had not. I read it twice. Then I called Susan. They're buying silence, I said. Yes, she replied. I won't take it, I said. I didn't think you would, she said. We declined the offer the same afternoon. That's when the tone changed. My father showed up at my apartment, unannounced. He stood in the hallway, coat still on, eyes sharp with the kind of anger he usually reserved for strangers who wasted his time. You've crossed a line, he said. I didn't invite him in. You crossed it first, I replied. This is family, he said, not a transaction. Then why did you treat it like one? I asked. He exhaled through his nose. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly at the end. That's not what her doctor wrote, I said calmly. His eyes flickered, just once. You went digging, he said. I read what was filed, I replied. You think you're smarter than us, he said. No, I said. I think the law doesn't care who you are. He stared at me for a long moment, then lowered his voice. If you push this, you'll lose more than money, he said. You'll lose us. I met his gaze. You already decided I was expendable, I said. I'm just responding accordingly. He left without another word. The week before the hearing, Susan uncovered one more detail. A loan, taken out against the lake property 6 months earlier. Small, but telling. Used to cover short-term liquidity for my father's business. They leveraged it without authority, she said. Meaning? I asked. Meaning they treated it as theirs, she replied. Which strengthens your claim. I closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't just about exclusion anymore. It was misuse. The night before the hearing, Daniel called. I didn't know about the loan, he said quietly. I believe you, I replied. You're going to win, he said. That's not what this is, I said. What is it then? He asked. I thought about that. It's about stopping the pattern, I said. Not just for me. He was quiet. I wish you'd talked to me first, he said. I wish you'd asked why I was removed, I replied. We hung up, without resolution. The courthouse was cold the next morning. Fluorescent lights, hard benches, people clutching folders and nerves. My parents sat together on one side of the room. Daniel sat behind them, looking like he hadn't slept. Susan sat beside me, composed. When our case was called, we stood. The judge was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics. She reviewed the filings, asked precise questions, and listened. Really listened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold. She simply asked why the lake property had been referenced without being transferred, why a loan had been taken out, why a beneficiary had been removed without notice. Each question landed quietly. By the end, my father looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. The judge didn't rule that day. She ordered mediation, and she froze all trust activity pending resolution. As we left the courtroom, my mother grabbed my arm. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. I gently removed her hand. I did, I said, because no one else would. Outside, the air felt different. Sharper, cleaner. Susan smiled slightly. They're on defense now, she said. I nodded. For the first time since this began, the imbalance had shifted. They no longer controlled the pace. And once that happens, everything else follows, including the truth they'd spent years assuming would never be questioned. Mediation was scheduled for the end of January, tucked between winter storms and the kind of gray days that make time feel suspended. The judge's order had done what no argument ever could. It had forced everyone to slow down. My parents hated that part most. They had always moved through life assuming momentum equaled authority. If they acted quickly enough, decisively enough, no one would stop to question the foundation beneath them. Now the foundation was under review. Susan prepared me carefully. We wouldn't be in a courtroom, no gavel, no audience, just a conference room, a neutral mediator, and documents spread across a long table. The tone would be civil, controlled. The pressure would come from what couldn't be denied. The goal isn't to convince them, Susan said. It's to create a record. I understood. At work, I was promoted that same week. Not ceremonially, just a quiet email from HR confirming my new title and responsibilities. Director of Regulatory Compliance. More oversight, more authority, more trust. No one congratulated me at home. That contrast didn't hurt the way it once would have. I'd stopped measuring validation across environments. Daniel texted me the morning of mediation. I don't know where I stand in this anymore, I replied honestly. You stand where you choose to stand. That's the part I didn't get. The mediation room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. The mediator, a man named Richard Hale, was polite and brisk. He outlined ground rules, then asked Susan to present. She did so calmly, line by line. Dates, filings, the will, the unfinished transfer, the loan. My parents' attorney responded with language that sounded practiced but thin. Intent, family understanding, oversight. Richard listened, occasionally raising an eyebrow. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I wasn't consulted, I said. I wasn't informed. I was removed after the fact and told it was for my own good. My mother looked at the table. Richard nodded. Thank you. Then he turned to my parents. Why was Claire excluded? He asked. My father cleared his throat. She's independent. She doesn't rely on family assets. That wasn't the question, Richard said gently. Why was she excluded? Silence. Not defensive silence. Unprepared silence. Daniel shifted in his chair. Finally, my mother spoke. We thought it would be simpler. Richard leaned back slightly. Simpler for whom? No one answered. The session ended without resolution, but something important had happened. The narrative they'd relied on had been spoken out loud and found wanting. Afterward, in the parking lot, Daniel approached me. I didn't know they'd leveraged the property, he said quietly. I know, I replied. They keep saying they did it to protect the family, he continued. But it doesn't feel like protection. No, I said. It feels like control. He nodded slowly. That night, my father emailed Susan directly. He proposed a revised settlement. 50% interest in the lake property to me. Immediate transfer. No admission of wrongdoing. Susan forwarded it with a single note. Your call. I sat with it longer this time. Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to understand what they were really offering. They weren't offering fairness. They were offering relief. From scrutiny. From consequences, from having to explain themselves further. I declined. Susan responded with a counterproposal. Full enforcement of Eleanor's original directive, equal split, court supervision. The reply came the next morning. We will not agree to that. Susan smiled when she read it. Then we proceed, she said. February arrived with heavy snow and heavier tension. The mediation record was filed. The judge reviewed it. A follow-up hearing was scheduled. In the meantime, the trust remained frozen. My parents' business began to feel the strain. Without access to the loan renewal, cash flow tightened. They canceled a trip, delayed renovations. Small signals of discomfort that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. I noticed, not with satisfaction. With clarity. My mother called again. This is hurting everyone, she said. No, I replied. It's revealing how much depended on me not speaking. She was quiet. Do you even care what happens to us? She asked. I thought carefully before answering. I care enough not to lie to make it easier, I said. She hung up. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. Documents spread across the table, snow piling against the windows. I felt tired, but not drained. Focused, but not consumed. I understood something then that had taken me years to accept. They weren't afraid of losing the asset. They were afraid of losing the story where they were generous parents, fair stewards, the kind of people who did right by their children. That story required my silence, and silence once broken can't be restored. The next phase wouldn't be quiet. The court would ask harder questions: financial disclosures, timelines, accountability. They could still choose transparency, or they could let the process choose for them. Either way, the decision was no longer theirs alone, and that was the point where power shifted permanently. By the time March arrived, the process had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a narrow probate dispute expanded, quietly but inevitably, into something larger. The court ordered full financial disclosure related to the lake property and the trust. That meant bank statements, loan documents, internal correspondence, not just intentions, but evidence. My parents complied reluctantly. Susan warned me this was the point where people usually cracked. Not emotionally, logistically. The effort of maintaining a version of events becomes exhausting when every document has to agree with the last one. At work, I led my first external audit as director. I watched executives squirm as I asked questions they'd assumed no one would ask. It struck me how similar the dynamics were. Authority built on habit collapses quickly under scrutiny. I recognized the pattern. So did the court. The first irregularity surfaced in a supplemental filing, a transfer between accounts tied to the lake property loan. The funds had been used to cover payroll shortfalls in my father's consulting firm. Not once, 3 times. Susan circled the entries in red. They treated it like a revolving line of credit, she said. Without disclosure, without authority. Is that fraud? I asked. She shook her head slightly. Not yet. But it's misrepresentation. Misrepresentation carries consequences. Daniel called that night. They're scared, he said. I'm not surprised, I replied. They didn't think this would go so far, he continued. They thought you'd take the money and let it go. I know, I said. They keep asking me to talk to you, he added. To convince you to stop. I paused. And what do you say? I asked. That I can't, he replied. Because I don't think you're wrong. That was the first time he'd said it. The second hearing took place mid-March, shorter, more technical. The judge reviewed the disclosures and asked for clarification on the loan usage. My father's attorney attempted to frame it as temporary necessity. The judge wasn't interested in necessity. She was interested in authorization. Was Mrs. Morgan informed that this property was used as collateral for business operations? She asked. No, the attorney admitted. Was she listed as a beneficiary at the time? The judge continued. Yes. The pause that followed felt long enough to register physically. Then we have a problem, the judge said. She ordered an independent forensic review. That was the moment the balance tipped irreversibly. Forensic reviews don't negotiate. They inventory. My mother stopped calling after that. Instead, an email arrived from my father. We need to talk, privately. This has gone too far. I forwarded it to Susan. Her reply was brief. It goes exactly as far as the evidence takes it. The review took 4 weeks. 4 weeks of silence, punctuated by document requests and sealed submissions. I filled my time with work, long walks, and an unexpected sense of peace. The waiting didn't feel like suspense. It felt like inevitability. When the forensic report was released to counsel, Susan called me into her office. They confirmed the misuse, she said. They also confirmed something else. I leaned forward. The trust amendment was timed, she said. Executed days after the first loan draw. I felt my chest tighten. They removed you, she continued, because your presence complicated access. There it was. Not philosophy. Not protection. Access. I exhaled slowly. What happens now? I asked. Susan met my eyes. Now the judge has discretion. And leverage. That night, Daniel showed up again. He looked older than his years. They didn't think you'd fight, he said. I didn't think I'd have to, I replied. They're talking about selling the business, he said, to cover everything. That's their choice, I said. He nodded. They keep saying you did this. I looked at him steadily. They did this when they decided my consent was optional, I said. He didn't argue. The final hearing was scheduled for early April. This time, my parents arrived separately. They didn't sit together. That alone told the story. The judge spoke clearly, without emotion. She ruled that Eleanor Morgan's original directive would be enforced. The lake property would be transferred into a separate holding as intended. Beneficiaries equally listed. She further ordered restitution related to the loan usage, payable from the trust to the estate, and she referred the matter of misrepresentation to a regulatory review. Not criminal, but consequential. My parents didn't look at me. Daniel did. Outside the courtroom, Susan shook my hand. "You did exactly what the system requires," she said. I nodded. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The numbers had stopped protecting them. And once numbers stop cooperating, stories lose their power. I walked out into the spring air, knowing something fundamental had changed. Not just the outcome. The dynamic. They could no longer act first and explain later. They could no longer decide for me. And that, more than any property or ruling, was what I'd taken back. The final chapters wouldn't be about punishment. They would be about what happens after control breaks, and how people respond when they're forced to live with the truth they tried to bypass. After the ruling, everyone expected fallout. Arguments, accusations, a final confrontation where things would be said out loud and lines would be drawn. None of that happened. What came instead was silence. Not the passive silence I'd lived with for years, but an active one. The kind that arrives when people no longer know which version of themselves to present. My parents stopped calling altogether. No updates, no requests, no attempts to explain. The family group chat went dormant. Its last message, a photo of Daniel's dog posted weeks earlier, unanswered. At work, things moved forward without friction. The audit cycle closed cleanly. A compliance framework I'd been designing for months was approved by the board without revision. They trusted my judgment now, not because I'd proven loyalty, but because I'd proven consistency. That distinction mattered. Daniel reached out once, asking if we could get coffee. I agreed, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to see who he was without our parents' expectations shaping every sentence. We met at a small place near the courthouse. Neutral ground. "They're selling the business," he said after we ordered. "It's the only way they can cover everything." "I figured," I replied. "They don't say your name," he added, not directly, "but it's there." I nodded. "They keep saying they don't recognize you," he said. I smiled faintly. "That makes sense. They never really saw me." He looked down at his coffee. I didn't either, not fully. That was the closest thing to an apology I expected. "I'm not angry at you," I said, "but I won't step back into the old roles." "I know," he replied. We talked about neutral things after that. Work, weather, his plans to move closer to the city. When we parted, there was no promise to stay close. Just an understanding that whatever relationship remained would have to be built deliberately. That night, I packed up the last box of Eleanor's letters and placed them in a filing cabinet at home. I didn't need to read them again. Their purpose had been fulfilled. The lake property transfer moved forward quietly under court supervision. No celebration, no announcement. I didn't visit right away. Ownership felt abstract compared to what it represented. Agency. My mother sent a single email in late April. "I hope you're happy." I read it once and archived it. Happiness wasn't the point. Alignment was. Susan checked in to confirm final paperwork and asked if I needed anything else. "No," I said. "This chapter is closed." She smiled. "Most people don't know when to stop." "I do," I replied. Spring turned into early summer. The pace of life normalized. I hosted a small dinner for friends, people who knew me outside of obligation. Laughter felt lighter without the undercurrent of performance. One evening, as I walked home, I realized something subtle but profound. I wasn't bracing anymore. No rehearsed explanations. No anticipation of disappointment. No calculation of how my choices might be received. I was simply choosing. The power my parents had held over me wasn't in the assets or the trust or even the house. It had been in their certainty that I would stay manageable. Once that certainty broke, everything else followed. The next chapter of my life wouldn't be defined by what I reclaimed. It would be defined by what I no longer allowed to be taken. And that realization, quiet and uncelebrated, was the most permanent shift of all. The first attempt came disguised as nostalgia. My mother left a voicemail on a Tuesday morning, her voice softer than it had been in months. "I was cleaning out a drawer and found some old photos," she said. "You and Eleanor at the lake. You were always so close." She didn't ask me to call back. She assumed I would. I didn't. Not because I was angry. Anger requires engagement. What I felt was distance, And distance doesn't argue with sentiment. It simply doesn't move. The second attempt came through paperwork. Susan forwarded me a draft document labeled Family Resolution Agreement. It wasn't filed. It wasn't requested by the court. It was a private proposal, unsigned. They want to redefine the narrative, Susan said on the phone. Not the outcome, the story. I read it carefully. It framed the entire dispute as a misunderstanding fueled by grief and timing. It praised my independence. It emphasized family unity. It proposed a joint statement acknowledging mutual respect and a shared desire to move forward. There was no mention of unauthorized loans, no acknowledgement of exclusion, no reference to the court's findings. In other words, it asked me to help them save face. I declined without comment. Susan didn't push. That tells them enough, she said. At work, I was asked to mentor a new hire. A woman in her late 20s, sharp and tentative, with the look of someone who'd learned to make herself small to be effective. She watched me closely in meetings, noting when I spoke and when I didn't. One afternoon she asked, "How do you know when to push and when to let something go?" I thought about it. "When the rules are clear, you don't need to push," I said. "You just point." She nodded, like that was something she'd needed to hear. The lake house paperwork finalized in May. My name appeared cleanly on the deed. No qualifiers, no asterisks. The transfer felt strangely anticlimactic. Ownership, I realized, isn't a feeling. It's a condition. Daniel called to let me know my parents were moving out of their house. Downsizing. Quietly. "They're telling people it was always the plan," he said. "Of course they are," I replied. "They're also saying the whole thing got blown out of proportion," he added. I smiled faintly. Things only feel blown out of proportion when they were meant to stay hidden. He didn't disagree. The real test came in June. My parents invited me to a family meeting. Neutral location. Private room at a restaurant. They framed it as a chance to reset. I considered it longer than I expected to, not because I was tempted to reconcile, but because I wanted to be sure I understood my own boundaries before entering a room where they had once shaped the conversation. I agreed to go. They arrived early. My mother hugged me tightly. Too tightly, as if physical closeness could substitute for acknowledgement. My father nodded, stiff and formal. Daniel sat between us. They spoke first. They talked about stress, about how hard the past months had been, about how none of this had been intended to hurt me, about how families sometimes make mistakes. I listened. When they finished, my mother leaned forward. "We want to move on," she said. "Together." I waited a beat. "What does that look like?" I asked. She hesitated. "Putting this behind us." "Specifically," I said. My father cleared his throat. "We don't want to keep revisiting the legal stuff." "I'm not revisiting it," I replied. "It's resolved." They exchanged a glance. "And the trust?" my mother asked. "It's settled," I said. "According to Eleanor's wishes." My father's jaw tightened. "We just don't want this to define us," he said. I met his eyes. "It doesn't define you," I said. "It reveals you." Silence fell over the table. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not interested in rewriting what happened," I continued. "And I'm not interested in pretending it didn't." "So what do you want?" my mother asked, her voice strained. I thought carefully. "I want contact without leverage," I said. "No expectations tied to access. No guilt framed as concern. No decisions made for me." My father scoffed softly. "That's not how families work." "That's how healthy ones do," I replied. The meeting ended politely, cordially. Nothing resolved. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter. Not because I'd drawn a line, but because I'd respected it. Later that week, Susan called to confirm the regulatory review had been closed. No further action. The restitution had satisfied requirements. "It's done," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It is." That night, I drove out to the lake alone. The house was exactly as I remembered. Quiet, solid, waiting. I sat on the dock as the sun dipped low, the water reflecting a sky in transition. I thought about how much effort my parents had spent trying to maintain control without appearing controlling, how much energy I'd spent accommodating that illusion, and how simple it felt now to let it fall away. They could rewrite stories, issue invitations, offer olive branches shaped like erasers. But they couldn't undo the moment I realized that love without respect isn't love, it's management. And once you see that clearly, you don't need revenge. You just stop participating. The final stretch of this story wouldn't involve them at all. It would involve what happens when a life finally belongs to the person living it, and how quiet that freedom can be. The strange thing about freedom is how ordinary it feels once it arrives. There was no dramatic shift the morning after I set my boundaries at that restaurant. No sense of triumph. No relief crashing over me. I woke up, made coffee, and went to work. But something subtle had changed. I wasn't bracing anymore. At the office, my calendar was full, but it no longer felt crowded. Meetings had purpose. Decisions had weight. I noticed how often people deferred to my judgment now, not because I insisted on it, but because I spoke when it mattered and stayed silent when it didn't. Authority, I learned, grows best in quiet soil. The lake house became part of my life slowly. I spent a few weekends there in early summer, not renovating, not fixing, just being present. I opened windows, swept floors, sat with Eleanor's old books stacked beside the couch. The place didn't feel like a prize. It felt like continuity. Daniel visited once. He stood on the dock with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water. "I forgot how peaceful it is here," he said. "You didn't forget," I replied. "You just didn't need it." He nodded, accepting that without argument. We talked more easily than we ever had. Not warmly, honestly, without performing roles for an invisible audience. He didn't ask forgiveness. I didn't offer it. We spoke as two adults who had seen the same truth from different angles. That felt like progress. At work, a new initiative landed on my desk. A compliance overhaul that would touch every department. Complex, political, risky. My director hesitated before assigning it to me. "It's sensitive," she said. "A lot of people won't like it." I met her gaze. "Then it needs to be done cleanly," she smiled. "Exactly why it's yours." I threw myself into it, not to prove anything, but because the work mattered. Structure had always been my language. It was how I made sense of chaos, how I turned tension into something navigable. In the evenings, I cooked more, walked longer, read without distraction. The quiet wasn't empty. It was expansive. My parents didn't reach out again. Not directly. I heard through Daniel that they were struggling with the downsizing, that my father's business was winding down faster than expected, that my mother seemed unsettled, unsure who she was without managing everyone else's lives. I felt sympathy. I didn't feel responsibility. One afternoon in July, Susan emailed me a final set of documents. Everything closed. Everything archived. "Congratulations," she wrote. "You handled this with remarkable restraint." I replied with a single sentence. I finally stopped explaining myself. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at the lake. Friends from work, a neighbor, one colleague who'd become a quiet confidant. We ate on the porch, laughed as the sun dipped low, and talked about things that had nothing to do with family or history. At one point, someone asked how I ended up with the place. I said simply, "It belonged to my grandmother." No qualifiers, no backstory. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the dock again. The water was dark and still, reflecting nothing but the moon. I thought about how much of my life I'd spent reacting to other people's expectations, trying to anticipate disappointment, trying to stay ahead of conflict by shrinking my needs. I hadn't lost my family. I'd lost the illusion that compliance was the same as love. And in losing that illusion, I'd gained something far more durable: choice. The final chapters of this story wouldn't involve courts or documents or confrontation. Those were already settled. What remained was the quieter work of building a life that didn't orbit around anyone else's approval. A life where decisions were mine because they were mine to make. And once that becomes your baseline, nothing else feels negotiable anymore. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, missed expectations, unreturned assumptions. The slow understanding that I was no longer orienting my life around theirs. Daniel was the first to notice. He called me one evening in August, his tone tentative in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom keeps asking when you're going to come by," he said. "She's talking about doing Thanksgiving early this year. Says she wants things to feel normal again." Normal. I leaned against my kitchen counter and looked out the window. The sun was setting later now. The day's still warm, but shifting. "I already have plans," I said. "You always have plans," he replied. Not accusing, just observing. Yes, I said. I do. There was a pause. She thought the lake house meant you'd come around more, he added. I didn't respond immediately. That's not how it works, I said finally. Ownership isn't an invitation. He exhaled slowly. I figured. A week later, my mother tried a different approach. She mailed a package to my apartment. Inside was a photo album I hadn't seen in years. Childhood vacations, birthdays, holidays. A careful curation of moments meant to remind me where I came from. There was no note, just the implication. I flipped through it once, then placed it back in the box and slid it into a closet. Not discarded, just no longer central. At work, the compliance overhaul reached its most delicate phase. Departments pushed back. Executives questioned timelines. One VP requested a private meeting and suggested we adjust the scope to keep things moving smoothly. I listened, took notes, thanked him for his input. Then, I declined. This framework exists to prevent problems we can't afford, I said. Convenience isn't a sufficient reason to compromise it. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Walking back to my office, I felt a familiar recognition. This was the same muscle. The one that lets you hold a line without justifying it. My parents called a family meeting without me, Daniel told me afterward. They're worried you're drifting away. I drifted years ago, I said. They just didn't notice. They think you're punishing them, he said. I considered that. I'm not, I replied. I'm choosing differently. That distinction mattered to me, even if it didn't to them. In September, my father sent an email, brief, polite, asking if I'd consider meeting him for coffee, just the two of us. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I was afraid, because I was weighing whether the conversation would add anything to my life or simply reopen a dynamic I'd already outgrown. I replied with a single sentence, I'm not ready for that. He didn't respond. Autumn settled in quietly. Leaves changed, air cooled. The lake reflected a deeper blue. I spent more time there, not escaping, but grounding. I wrote more, planned less. Let things unfold without forcing them into shape. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at my parents, not at Daniel, not even at myself. Anger requires a sense of injustice that still needs to be argued. What I felt now was acceptance. Not forgiveness. Acceptance. They had acted according to who they were. I had responded according to who I had become. Those two things no longer needed to align. The last message from my mother came near the end of the month. I hope one day you understand we did what we thought was best. I read it once. Then I archived it. Because understanding doesn't require agreement. And closure doesn't require consensus. The truth was, they hadn't lost me because of the court, or the property, or the documents. They lost me the moment they assumed my adulthood was optional. And once that assumption broke, there was no version of normal to return to, only a new reality. One where my life no longer revolved around managing other people's comfort. And that, I knew, was the point of no return. By October, the world had settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar and strangely steady. Not calm, not joyful, just honest. At work, the compliance overhaul passed its final review. The board approved it unanimously. There was a brief round of congratulations, a few handshakes, then everyone moved on. No lingering praise, no need to frame it as a personal victory. That was fine with me. I'd learned to recognize progress that didn't need witnesses. The lake house became quieter as fall deepened. I spent fewer nights there, but when I did, I noticed details I'd missed before. How the floorboards creaked in certain spots. How Eleanor had marked pages in her books with folded corners instead of bookmarks. How the silence there wasn't empty, but layered. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by answering questions that weren't really questions. Why aren't you more flexible? Why do you need things in writing? Why can't you just let it go? They were never requests for understanding. They were instructions, disguised as curiosity. I stopped answering them. Daniel called once more, early in the month. His voice sounded tired. They're not doing well, he said. I know, I replied. They keep saying they don't understand how things got so distant. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. They don't need to understand, I said. They need to accept. He was quiet for a moment. I think I'm starting to, he said. That surprised me. Not because it changed anything, but because it showed me how different our paths had become. He was only beginning to ask questions I'd answered years ago in silence. I'm not asking you to choose sides, he added. I just want you to know I see it now. I believed him. And still, I didn't offer reassurance. Seeing doesn't undo. It informs. After the call, I sat with the feeling that followed. Not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity. There was nothing left to resolve. The story my parents wanted to tell about our family required a version of me that no longer existed. The story I lived now didn't need their approval to continue. That realization stripped the situation of its remaining tension. Late one afternoon, Susan emailed me. Not with documents or updates, but a simple note. I'm closing your file. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I smiled at that. Files closed, records archived, processes complete. The language of resolution felt familiar and fitting. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself and ate slowly, without distraction. Outside, the air had cooled enough to hint at winter. Inside, everything felt settled. I thought about Eleanor then, about how she'd lived quietly, deliberately, without needing to dominate the room. How she'd trusted that details mattered, even when no one else seemed to care. She'd been right. The final test came unexpectedly. A mutual acquaintance reached out, someone who'd known my parents for years. She asked, gently, if everything was okay between us, if maybe things had gotten out of hand, if I regretted how it all played out. I didn't feel defensive. I don't regret telling the truth, I said. I regret that it needed to be told at all. She nodded, understanding more than she said. After that conversation, something inside me settled for good. I realized I'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. I no longer measured my choices against how they might be received. I didn't preemptively soften decisions to preserve relationships that only functioned when I stayed small. I wasn't waiting for permission, and I wasn't waiting to be missed. The final chapter of this story wouldn't be about reconciliation or revenge, or even justice. It would be about what happens after all the noise fades, when the questions stop, when the explanations end, when the only thing left is the life you've chosen, lived quietly, fully, and without apology. And that, I knew, was where this story truly concluded. By the time winter arrived, nothing felt unfinished anymore. That was the part people never talk about. They expect endings to come with closure that feels dramatic or emotional. Tears, reconciliation, final words that tie everything neatly together. That didn't happen. What happened instead was quieter, more permanent. Snow fell early that year. The lake froze in thin sheets, the surface pale and still. I drove out one last time before the roads became unreliable, just to walk through the house and make sure everything was secure. I turned off the water, closed the shutters, locked the doors. Simple actions, practical, final in a way that didn't need ceremony. Standing in the living room, I realized I wasn't saying goodbye to anything. I was acknowledging ownership, not just of the house, but of my life. Back in the city, my routines continued. Work was steady. The systems I'd built were functioning without intervention. That was the real measure of success for me. Not visibility, not praise. Stability that didn't depend on my constant presence. At work, my director asked me to take on a larger role the following year. More oversight, more authority, less hands-on work. Think about it, she said. You've earned the trust. I said I would. For once, the decision wasn't urgent. It didn't come with pressure or expectation. It was simply an option, placed in front of me, waiting. My parents didn't reach out again. Neither did I. Daniel sent a holiday text. Simple, neutral, no emotional hooks. I replied in kind. That was the shape our relationship had taken now. Defined, limited, real. On Christmas morning, I woke up alone and felt no sense of loss. I made coffee, opened a book, let the day unfold without agenda. Later, I met friends for dinner. Laughter came easily. Conversation flowed without caution. No one asked me to be anything other than present. That was the gift. As the year closed, I thought back to the moment everything shifted. Not the court ruling, not the documents, not the meetings. The real turning point had been internal. It was the moment I understood that love offered conditionally is not love. It is leverage. And once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. I didn't take revenge in the way people imagine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't demand apologies or validation. I removed access. I documented truth. I let systems do what they are designed to do when emotions are unreliable. And then I walked away. What my family lost wasn't property or money or reputation. They lost the version of me who absorbed discomfort to keep the peace. The version who explained herself. The version who waited. What I gained wasn't power over them. It was power over myself. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I'll leave you with this. You don't owe loyalty to people who only value you when you're manageable. You don't owe explanations to those who ignore facts. And you don't need to destroy anyone to reclaim what is already yours. Sometimes the most effective revenge is clarity. Sometimes the strongest boundary is silence. And sometimes choosing yourself is the only ending the story ever needed. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe. Not for me, but to remind yourself that your life belongs to you.